Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Capatillo. I'm a Nez Perce tribal member, and I've worked for the Nez Perce Tribe's Department of Fisheries Resources Management for about 10 years. I'm the aquatic invasive species biologist, and I'm in charge of addressing and monitoring aquatic invasive species throughout the usual and accustomed homelands of the Nimiipuu, which covers a good portion of Idaho, southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon, and parts of Wyoming and Montana. Today, I would like to discuss the impacts that invasive species have on our indigenous resources, our culture and cultural practices, and our identity. There are several invasive species already present within the traditional homelands of the Nimiipuu. Some we know are causing major issues with our cultural resources and our traditional way of life by disrupting food webs and altering ecosystems. Others, we are unsure of the severity of the impacts due to a lack of information and limited interactions with those invasive species. Pictured here are some of the aquatic invasive species of concern for the Nez Perce tribe, but more seem to be knocking on our door as climate changes and other environmental conditions push invasive species into new territories where they're able to outcompete native species. Smallmouth bass were introduced to the Snake River Basin in the 1980s as a game fish, and they now have well-established populations throughout the Snake River and parts of the Clearwater River. The New Zealand mud snail began its invasion into Idaho in the 1980s and were first observed in the Snake River, where they have spread since. Recently, walleye have been seen coming over Lower Granite Dam in increasing numbers, which has caused anglers and fish biologists upstream some major concerns. Both invasive species of fish mentioned can decimate salmonid populations due to their ferocious and opportunistic feeding habits. Invasive species such as the New Zealand mud snail can cause issues as they outcompete native species for space and food. But another concern that we have with them is their ability to pass through an entire digestive system of a fish or a bird and remain not only intact, but they'll still be alive. So there's no nutritional value when they are eaten. Invasive aquatic plants can also provide great shelter for ambush predators, and they alter stream flow and water quality as they grow thick along the banks. Some invasive plants, as we've seen in earlier presentations, can also be toxic and be a danger to domestic animals and wildlife. The impacts on indigenous cultural resources, they're very widespread. Some you can see happening before your very eyes, and some take years of observation to even notice. All our cultural resources rely on each other to continue to thrive and grow. As invasive species continue to move in, native species begin to get pushed out, and the ecosystem is thrown completely out of balance, further affecting native species health as well as water and land quality. The nutrients that anadromous species carry from the ocean to the headwaters are vital for stream health and plant growth. As the bodies of anadromous species break down, they provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and other important nutrients to the water and the land. This allows vegetation to often grow 3 times faster than they would without these anadromous species interactions and relationships, which can be seen up to a mile off the stream. Indigenous foods and medicines often rely on the waters and nutrients found in these streams. In the photos shown here, you can see some of the native species that the Nimiipuu and other indigenous communities find very important to our cultural way of life. In the photos shown on the top right, you may see an overgrown field, but I see at least 3 traditional foods and medicines that are very important to some indigenous communities. Now on this slide here, you can see where the Nez Perce tribe releases some juvenile salmonids into the Snake River Basin. And take note of where different invasive species have been observed and consider the impacts that the different species can have on native species throughout those areas. Some of these areas have voracious invasive fish populations downstream of juvenile salmonid release sites, which makes them easy prey as they become acclimated to the system and begin to migrate to the ocean. Other invasive species here are taking up space and resources that can be utilized by those salmonids. Areas with an overlap of invasive species and salmonid spawning and rearing habitat also cause alarm for much of the same reasons as them overlapping with tribal acclimation and release sites. And more recently, the Nez Perce tribe has started exploring ways to address avian predators who are beginning to show up in greater numbers during salmonid releases and migration. These overlapping areas are going to be the main focus for monitoring and the eventual removal of invasive species to support native species and the various natural resources projects that are going on throughout this region. The impacts on indigenous resources eventually leads to impacts in indigenous culture and cultural experiences. In the top left picture, you can see my children when we stopped for photos at the Whitebird Battlefield Lookout where Nimiipuu had conflict with the United States Army. As we travel through this area to fish for salmon and gather other cultural resources, we often stop here and talk about the battles that occurred during the flight of the Nez Perce, as our family was directly involved in that historical conflict from the very beginning. In the photos below, you see where I'm pointing out different land formations or animals to tell traditional stories to my children. The other photos you see are various family interactions that we have together as we fish, hunt, gather roots, berries, and medicines, and even while we process our traditional foods. During each of these activities, we share in traditional legends and family history that ties us to our environment and tell us of our obligations as Indigenous stewards of the land and the rules that we must follow while participating in these activities to ensure that we're doing them correctly and with the utmost respect. One photo that I really want to point out here on this slide can be seen on the bottom left. My grandparents had never been to the Imnaha River before, despite it being in the homelands of the Nimipu from the band of Nez Perce that we originate from. I took my children there to fish and gave my grandfather directions so he and my grandmother could meet us there. If there were no salmon in that river, there would have been no reason for us to go there, and my grandparents would have gone their entire lives without ever seeing the salmon swimming in the river or feeling the cool breeze coming off the water. In those experiences are the traditional practices themselves, which will also be lost if native species are pushed out. At times, we've had to change how we harvest resources when availability is low. Other times, we may lose complete access to certain areas. In these circumstances, traditional methods may be set aside for the use of less impactful or more selective means of harvesting. Gaffs and spears were often used in smaller tributaries and are still used today. But without fish in those areas, we no longer have use for those methods, which leads to a loss of knowledge on how to create and use those tools or where to even find materials to make them. These losses won't just occur only in the way that we harvest our foods and medicines, but in the way we process and use them as well. Being able to dry, can, and smoke meats and other foods and medicines is very important to Indigenous communities who rely on those resources throughout the entire year. We continue to build connections and relationships with the resources as we process and preserve them while learning from each other. On this slide, you can see various photos of those processes. Another aspect that we need to discuss is our use of the various plants and animal parts to create materials such as bone handle knives, fish spears, clothing, and other objects we use throughout our culture. Invasive species could reduce the availability of resources used to make those cultural materials. Next to the dried and smoked salmon on the top right of the slide, you will see a rawhide clock made by my grandfather. This clock is made the same way that our hand drums are made. My grandfather even made the wooden frame with 7 sides to represent the 7-drum religion. Each of the feathers hanging from the clock represent my 4 children with their initials beaded on them. I found those feathers along the same rivers we harvest our salmon and resources from. Below that, you'll see a photo of my oldest child using a basket that has been passed down through my family for generations and is used to gather our traditional foods and medicines. You can also see a photo of my children enjoying a hot spring during one of our fishing trips. While in the hot spring, we were able to soothe our aches and pains as we prayed for and gave thanks to the salmon and other traditional resources that we gathered while we were in the area. When you look at the relationships our resources have with their environment from a biological standpoint, it's easy to see the complications that occur when an invasive species becomes established in a new area. Growth and production have very complex sets of characteristics which are very sensitive to environmental changes. Nutrition, metabolism, energy storage and excretion, reproduction, and other biological characteristics become negatively affected as invasive species move in and push native species out. These impacts, or altogether losing these resources, affects other wildlife. Animals coming out of harsh winter conditions begin to track their food sources back to streams where anadromous species are found. Wildlife drags these carcasses up the banks into the forest where the marine nutrients can be shared with other animals, plants, and insects. And these are the types of relationships that influence and have major impacts on our Indigenous cultural experiences. As we go to these same areas to gather our resources, we have learned from the plants and the animals. We gather our plant and medicine resources in a way that supports their growth and production. We recognize the relationships all throughout nature, and we discuss those teachings with our youth. The methods and tools that we use have come from these experiences and these observations. Our ceremonies honor those relationships and experiences, and they encourage the continued use and the protection of those knowledge systems. These teachings and practices help us maintain a connection with our ancestors while instilling traditional values into future generations. There is a time when the Nimipu had a band of people on every tributary throughout our usual and custom homelands. For each of those tributaries, we had many names, stories, and materials which tied our culture to those specific areas. We had intimate relationships with the land and those resources. Traditional stories of the animal people and how they got their names tell us of our cultural obligations and how the animal people gave themselves to us for our survival and how we are to use their bones and hides for tools and clothing. They tell us how the bear taught us to dig roots and catch salmon, how the buffalo gave himself so that we could create the teepee, and how the Columbia River was formed. These traditional experiences and knowledge systems don't just tie us to our environment, they tie us to our communities. They tie us to our past as well as our future as we pass these experiences down through the generations. We can see the representation of those stories in our family history in the cliff faces and the land features. Once we no longer have cultural resources in these areas, we no longer have reasons to travel there, and we begin to lose the cultural language and the history that ties us to those key places and what gives us our identity.
Anthony, you have 4 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. A lot of work has actually gone into monitoring, restoring, and protecting Indigenous resources throughout the Pacific Northwest. In protecting those resources, we're ensuring another level of protection for our Indigenous culture, our cultural practices, and our knowledge systems. Millions of dollars have gone into habitat restoration, native species protection and conservation, barrier removals and improvements, native species reintroductions and translocations, tracking and monitoring of threatened and endangered species populations while assessing their success and survival rates, educational outreach. The list just seems to go on, but there's still more work that needs to be done. The knowledge and perspectives that tribal communities hold could be valuable in the fight against invasive species. It's important that these tribal communities are involved in all levels, since dealing with these invasive species issues has direct influences on our efforts to protect our cultural resources and our practices. So far, Western science has only proven what our Indigenous communities have known for thousands of years. This tells me that we could still be holding a key to some unanswered questions when it comes to invasive species issues. As climate conditions continue to change in a way that favors invasive species over native species, the impacts of invasive species on Indigenous culture will become an ever-growing threat that will need to be addressed in some way. Different species invasions have different levels of impacts, but they all lead to the same end results: a loss of resources, a loss of culture, and a loss of identity. In the end, it doesn't really matter if you're tribal or non-tribal. We all identify ourselves based off where we live, what we do, and who or what we represent in our communities. There are times when these resources are vital, even for relationships between communities, and we must maintain a perspective that can help us see eye to eye on these natural resource issues. For many of us, especially those with Indigenous ties, we identify ourselves as hunters, fishermen, root diggers, berry pickers, spiritual leaders, cultural protectors, and providers. These resources, whether you see them as cultural or recreational, are vital in our everyday lives, and we should all recognize our obligations as stewards of our environment and our cultures. Losing any one aspect of our culture means losing who we are and who our children will become. When I ask my children, what is it that makes you Indigenous to your homelands? I want them to point out each of the things that I've discussed with you here today. I want them to be able to tell me who they are and who they come from. I want them to know that we come from the land and the animals just as we come from our ancestors. I want to know they will continue sharing in these experiences with the community and pass them down to their children just as I passed it to them from my elders. We may call these our resources, our land, our water, and our cultural teachings, but we're just borrowing them from and protecting them for our future generations. Thank you very much.